It was an early winter morning, and the neighborhood was cloaked in silence. The sky was heavy with clouds, casting a gray hue over the empty streets. The cold air bit at the skin, and only the occasional chirp of a distant bird broke the stillness. People remained inside, their homes shielding them from the chill, and the world seemed paused in a deep, frozen breath. But that stillness was about to be shattered. Staggering out of his parked car, Victor, a man in his early 50s, tightened his coat around him. His face was tense, the lines of stress and frustration etched deep into his features. His night had been long, filled with loud company and too many drinks. The leftover anger from an argument he couldn't even remember still lingered in his chest. Victor's boots scraped against the pavement as he slammed the car door shut. Just as he turned toward the entrance of his apartment building, he noticed movement by the curb. A small, scruffy dog stood there, shivering, its fur matted and thin. The dog's large, frightened eyes met his for a brief second. Victor frowned, scowling. "Stray mutt," he muttered under his breath. Then, without thinking, without caring, he lifted his foot and kicked the dog hard in the side. The dog yelped, its thin body collapsing momentarily before it scrambled to its feet and bolted into the shadows, disappearing behind a parked car. Victor didn't even glance back. In his mind, it was just a stray, worthless and forgettable. He stomped toward his building, the sound of his boots echoing in the empty street. But fate had a lesson waiting for him. Moments later, Victor returned to his car, fumbling with his keys. That's when he heard it, a low, steady growl. He turned slowly, confusion furrowing his brow. At first, he saw nothing. Then, from the alleys and dark corners of the street, shadows began to move. Dogs, dozens of them. They crept from every direction, their eyes locked on him with an unsettling intensity. Their growls deepened, blending into a chilling symphony that filled the cold air. They weren't barking wildly. No, this was different. This was organized, intentional. Victor froze. The dogs advanced slowly, closing in around his car, their hackles raised, teeth bared, and eyes burning with something Victor couldn't comprehend. He backed up instinctively, fumbling to unlock his car, but it was too late. In a sudden, coordinated burst, the dogs lunged, not at him, but at his car. They clawed at the doors, gnawed on the tires, and scraped their teeth against the paint. One large dog leaped onto the hood, snarling as its paws dented the metal. Another tore at the windshield wipers. The noise was deafening. Growls, scratching, metal bending under pressure. Victor watched in disbelief, his eyes wide with terror. His beloved car, once gleaming and pristine, was being ripped apart before his eyes. "Stop!" he screamed, his voice breaking. But the dogs didn't stop. They didn't even flinch. Victor's mind raced. He tried waving his arms, yelling louder, even throwing small rocks at them. Nothing worked. The dogs remained fixated on the car, their fury unrelenting. And then it dawned on him. This wasn't random. They knew. They knew what he had done. Victor's legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the curb, shaking. The cold of the pavement seeped into his bones, but it was nothing compared to the cold realization in his heart. What he had done to one of them had come back to him, tenfold. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the dogs began to retreat. One by one, they melted back into the shadows, leaving behind a scene of destruction. Victor's car was barely recognizable, scratched, dented, and torn. His breath came in shallow gasps, his hands trembling. The early morning sun began to rise, casting a pale light over the ruined car and the man sitting in the cold. Victor was left alone, staring at the wreckage and grappling with a terrifying truth. The world doesn't forget, and neither do those you hurt. The morning air was still heavy, the silence of the neighborhood broken only by distant, sporadic barks. The man, whose careless kick had set things in motion, had retreated to the comfort of his apartment. He didn't give the scruffy dog a second thought. In his mind, it was just another stray, insignificant and forgettable. But beyond his door, something was stirring. Unbeknownst to him, the injured dog had limped away, whimpering softly. Its pain, however, wasn't the end. It was the beginning. From the shadows, other dogs had been watching. Stray dogs, forgotten by society, formed silent communities, bound by survival and instinct. They watched how one of their own had been hurt. And though they couldn't speak, their actions would speak louder than words ever could. Farther down the street, nestled in the corner of a quiet alley, an elderly woman named Margaret sat on a worn bench feeding the birds. She was a familiar figure in the neighborhood, always offering scraps to the strays and speaking softly to them as if they could understand. And perhaps, in a way, they did. Margaret noticed the scruffy dog limping past her, its eyes dull with pain. She gasped softly and reached into her bag for a piece of bread. "Oh, you poor soul," she whispered. But the dog didn't stop. It was heading somewhere with a quiet, determined purpose. Moments later, the alley seemed to come alive. From the shadows emerged more dogs, quiet, watchful, and moving with unsettling coordination. Margaret watched in awe as they followed the injured one. "What are you all up to?" she murmured, clutching her coat tighter around her frail body. The dogs moved like a silent army, disappearing into the maze of streets. Meanwhile, inside his apartment, the man began preparing for work, oblivious to the brewing storm. He whistled casually, sliding on his jacket, ready to head back to his car. The scuff on his boot from kicking the dog was the only evidence of his cruelty, and even that seemed insignificant to him. But as he approached the street, he froze. His beloved car, his polished, well-maintained Volkswagen, was surrounded. Dozens of dogs had gathered around it, their eyes locked onto the vehicle with a chilling intensity. They weren't barking wildly or growling. They were focused, eerily quiet, as if waiting. The injured dog sat among them, its head low but its eyes sharp. What is this?" the man stammered, disbelief creeping into his voice. And then it began. Without warning, the dogs lunged at the car. Their teeth scraped against the metal, claws scratched the paint, and they tore at the tires with alarming precision. It wasn't random chaos, it was focused, purposeful. The dogs attacked the very thing the man valued most. His prized possession was becoming a shredded, dented wreck before his eyes. "No, stop, get away!" he screamed, running toward them, flailing his arms. But the dogs didn't flinch. They tore and bit, working together with unsettling unity. The man's shouts echoed into the empty streets, but there was no one to help him, no one to stop them. Margaret watched from the alley, a hand pressed to her mouth. She didn't understand how or why, but she knew one thing for sure. The dogs weren't acting without reason. The man fell to his knees, breathless, watching in horror as the dogs continued their assault. He could do nothing but witness the destruction. His car, once spotless and shining, was now scarred and broken. And then, just as suddenly as they had begun, the dogs stopped. They stepped back, their eyes never leaving the man. The injured dog, standing at the forefront, stared at him, silent, unblinking. Then, as if signaled, they turned and vanished into the maze of alleys and streets, leaving the man trembling beside his ruined car. For a long time he sat there in the cold, the silence around him louder than any bark. His heart pounded in his chest, not from fear of the dogs, but from the crushing realization of what had just happened. This wasn't random, it was justice. In that moment, he understood the weight of his cruelty. Life had a way of returning what you gave, and now, all he could do was sit and face it. The days following the brutal attack on Max seemed endless for Emma. Every moment was filled with anxiety and guilt, knowing that a simple act of cruelty had unleashed something far greater than anyone could have expected. Max, once a timid and gentle stray, now stayed close to Emma, his trust in humans severely shaken. But it wasn't just Max who had changed. The entire neighborhood was on edge. Strange occurrences began happening around town. Stray dogs that had always kept to themselves now roamed the streets in larger groups, moving with unsettling coordination. They no longer flinched at the sound of footsteps or passing cars. Their eyes seemed to follow people with an eerie intensity, as though they were silently watching, waiting. Emma noticed it first on her way to the grocery store. Packs of dogs stood at the street corners, their eyes fixed on passers-by. People crossed to the other side of the street, whispering nervously. Rumors spread quickly. Some said the dogs had become aggressive, damaging property and scaring children. Others believed the animals were being led by something, or someone, with a purpose. Emma's neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, shared her fears over tea one evening. "I heard the dogs cornered Mr. Grant at the park," she whispered, glancing nervously out the window. "They didn't attack him, but they didn't let him leave until someone came to help." Emma's hands tightened around her cup. She knew this wasn't normal. She glanced at Max, who lay curled by the fire, his eyes wary but soft when they met hers. "This isn't like them," Emma murmured. "Something's wrong." Meanwhile, Thomas grew increasingly paranoid. His once confident stride had turned into a hurried shuffle, always glancing over his shoulder. The damage to his car was only the beginning. His home became the next target. Late one night, Thomas was jolted awake by the sound of scratching at his front door. It was faint at first but grew louder, more urgent. He crept to the window and peered through the blinds. In the dim glow of the street lamp, he saw them, dogs, dozens of them, sitting, watching. Thomas's heart pounded. He double-checked every lock, shut every curtain, but the scratching continued. Then came the howls, long, mournful cries that echoed through the empty streets. Sleep became impossible. The dogs never left. Emma couldn't ignore the growing fear in the town. She decided to confront Thomas, believing that his cruelty might be connected to this strange behavior. One afternoon, she approached him cautiously as he loaded his car. His hands trembled, and dark circles hung under his eyes. "Thomas, we need to talk," Emma said firmly. He glared at her. "About what?" "About the dog you kicked, about Max." His face paled. "That mutt? This has nothing to do with me." Emma's eyes narrowed. "Then why are they following you?" Thomas's grip on his keys tightened. Without another word, he slammed the car door and drove off, tires screeching. Emma watched him go, a sense of dread settling over her. Something had to be done. That evening, Emma gathered the townspeople at the local community hall. Fear had spread through the town like wildfire, but Emma believed understanding could lead to peace. "We need to stop being afraid," she told them. "These dogs aren't acting out of malice. They're responding to something, to someone." Murmurs filled the room. "But what can we do?" someone asked. Emma took a deep breath. "We need to make things right." The following days were unusually tense in the quiet neighborhood. The man, whose name was Victor, became increasingly paranoid. Every sound of distant barking made him flinch. He couldn't escape the nagging feeling that the dogs were still watching him, waiting. The once proud man, who had strutted through the streets with arrogance, now hurried home, casting nervous glances over his shoulder. But the dogs did not return. Instead, something far more unsettling began to unfold. Victor's neighbors, who had once greeted him with casual nods or brief conversations, now seemed distant. Whispers followed him as he walked past. People peered through curtains. Mothers pulled their children closer, and familiar faces grew cold. It was as if the neighborhood itself had turned against him. One afternoon, Victor heard a soft knock at his door. Hesitant, he opened it to find Mr. Harris, an elderly man who lived 2 houses down. Mr. Harris was known for his kindness and his gentle Labrador buddy. "I heard what happened with the dogs," Mr. Harris began, his voice calm but steady. "You know, animals have a way of sensing things in people." Victor scoffed. "What are you saying, that I deserved it?" Mr. Harris didn't flinch. "I'm saying maybe it's time you think about why it happened." Victor stared at him, speechless. Without another word, Mr. Harris turned and walked away, Buddy trotting at his side. That night, Victor sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the shadows dancing on the walls. His once pristine car, still scarred and dented, sat motionless in the driveway, a daily reminder of his actions. Unable to sleep, Victor paced the room. His mind was restless. He thought about the stray dog he had kicked, its wide, fearful eyes. For the first time, guilt crept into his heart. Driven by a restless urge, Victor decided to step outside. The cold night air bit at his skin as he walked aimlessly down the street. Without realizing it, his feet led him to the same spot where he had first encountered the stray dog. But tonight, something was different. There, curled up under a flickering street lamp, was the dog. Thin, shivering, but alive. Its eyes met his, filled not with fear, but cautious curiosity. Victor froze. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Victor slowly knelt, lowering himself to the dog's level. His breath formed soft clouds in the cold air. I'm sorry," he whispered, unsure if the words meant anything. The dog didn't run. It simply watched him, head tilted slightly. Victor hesitated before pulling off his scarf and carefully placing it on the ground near the dog. The animal sniffed it, but didn't approach. Feeling foolish but strangely lighter, Victor stood and walked away. But the seed had been planted. The next day, Victor returned with food. He placed it near the same spot and waited at a distance. The dog approached slowly, sniffed, and cautiously ate. Day after day, Victor returned, bringing food and water. He spoke softly, never making sudden moves. Over time, the dog began to trust him, inching closer with each visit. One cold morning, Victor extended his hand. The dog hesitated, but after a moment, leaned forward and gently sniffed his fingers. Victor smiled. "Let's call you Shadow?" Victor's transformation didn't go unnoticed. Neighbors began to see him sitting near Shadow, speaking gently, leaving out blankets during colder nights. Slowly, the wall between him and the community began to crack. One evening, as Victor sat beside Shadow, Mr. Harris walked by. "Looks like you've made a friend," Mr. Harris remarked, smiling. Victor looked up. "Yeah, I think I have." Mr. Harris nodded knowingly. Funny how life works, isn't it? Victor chuckled softly. "Yeah, funny." But deep down, he knew it was more than that. It was change, real change. The neighborhood had slowly returned to its quiet routine, but the memory of that morning lingered. The man, once careless and dismissive, now walked with a cautious awareness. His heart was heavier, not just because of the damage to his car, but because of the realization that his actions had consequences far beyond what he imagined. The pack of dogs had long dispersed, leaving behind only the haunting reminder of their collective response. Yet, the stray dog he had kicked, the one that had started it all, lingered in his thoughts. Guilt gnawed at him. He couldn't forget the fear in the dog's eyes or the silent message delivered by the pack. One afternoon, while passing by the alley where it all began, he spotted the dog again. It was curled up in the corner, its body thin and fragile. But this time, the man didn't turn away. He hesitated, his mind battling between pride and remorse. Slowly, he approached, careful not to startle the animal. He knelt a few feet away, pulling a sandwich from his coat pocket, the one he had bought for lunch. With a shaky hand, he tore a piece and gently placed it on the ground. The dog lifted its head cautiously, its eyes wary but curious. "I'm sorry," he whispered, barely audible. Minutes passed in silence before the dog inched forward, sniffing the food. Slowly, it took the offering, its eyes never leaving his. It was a small step, but it was enough. The man sighed, feeling a weight lift off his chest. Days turned into weeks, and the man found himself returning to that spot, each time bringing food and speaking softly to the stray. Over time, the dog's wariness began to fade. Its tail, once tucked in fear, now wagged cautiously. The barrier between them slowly crumbled. Neighbors began to notice the change too. The man, once known for his cold demeanor, now carried a softness in his eyes. The dog, once alone, began following him at a distance during his morning walks. What started as a silent apology had grown into a quiet companionship. One rainy afternoon, as the man walked home, he heard soft footsteps behind him. Turning around, he saw the dog standing there, soaked but waiting. Without thinking, he gestured toward his house. "Come on," he said quietly. To his surprise, the dog followed. Inside the small house, the warmth of the heater and the scent of fresh food filled the air. The man laid a towel by the door, watching as the dog cautiously stepped in, shaking off the rain. He placed a bowl of water and some leftover meat near the fireplace. For the first time in a long while, the house didn't feel so empty. Days passed, and the dog slowly became part of his life. He named him Shadow, a fitting name for the silent figure that now followed him everywhere. Shadow would rest by his feet as he read the newspaper, greet him at the door after errands, and accompany him on quiet walks through the neighborhood. The man had learned a hard lesson, but it had led him to something far more meaningful than he ever expected. A bond built not on ownership but on trust and redemption. One evening, sitting by the fireplace with Shadow curled up beside him, the man stared into the flickering flames. He thought about how one cruel moment had spiraled into this unexpected friendship. "Funny how life works," he muttered, scratching Shadow behind the ears. The dog let out a content sigh, shifting closer. And so, a man who once acted without thinking had been taught the value of kindness and second chances. All it took was the loyalty of a dog to remind him that compassion could rebuild even the most broken bridges. If this story touched your heart, remember that every action we take matters. Be kind, be compassionate, and let every moment be a chance to do good. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire and remind us of the power of kindness.